Game design is really complicated. Even before you get to the immensely talented people who work incredibly hard, programming, modeling, animating, and texturing games, the people who write the story and the dialogue, the musicians who compose the music for the game, the voice actors who bring the characters to life, and of course the QA testers who make sure the game isn't just raw garbage on release day. Even before the monumental and intricate work of everything else that goes into a game, the most basic element, the gameplay, is itself really complicated. Why is that? Well, I suppose on a very basic level, game design is about understanding how people react to things, and what kind of reactions you want from a player, and why, and then figuring out how to get them, and every little part of that sentence is a huge question in and of itself. Today, I want to ask how Resident Evil makes you afraid on a technical level. Like, how do you make a game that makes people react like this?
No, 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 no.
If you want to understand game design, Resident Evil is actually a great place to learn. The series may, at times, struggle to tell a story that you can follow along and understand, but it tells a crystal clear story in its design. And today, I want to look at that story, to understand the franchise from a different perspective. This is a franchise that threw a lot at the wall and had to sift through everything that stuck, combining and recombining, deconstructing and redesigning until today we find ourselves in the midst of a Resident Evil renaissance. This is the game design story of decades of hard work that produced a truckload of hits and a fuck ton of misses, and still manages to bring around everything and produce some of the sharpest AAA games being made today. This is... Welcome to Resimania, a video essay trilogy about Resident Evil where I've played over 90 hours of zombie games and people keep on giving me money, so I keep talking about it. Like all good stories, our story tonight contains big, hunky men. Some of them good, some of them bad. Large, rocket-propelled grenades, and at least one, hypothetically, cute dog. In this episode of Resimania, we need to expand our scope a little, but not to consider the other games, or the multimedia franchise. Rather, we need to consider the extraneous attempts, the discarded projects, the content that hit the cutting room floor. Your posts are bangers and your selfies are hot. Congrats, sweetie! But now show me the drafts. Video games, of course, were invented by Satan to destabilize society by convincing teens to smoke estrogen and touch butts, and as such, the industry has always been the domain of evil. Wait, where was I going with this bit? Capcom were reportedly on the brink of bankruptcy when Resident Evil 1 was being developed, which is why the team behind the first game started small. In fact, when Shinji Mikami was first tasked with the Sweet Home remake that would become Biohazard, the game we call Resident Evil, he was the entire team. The game was entirely his vision, at least while Capcom added more staff to his team and he trained them up for the project. Sound designer Hideaki Yatsumi said in interviews that he used the voices of the staff for the moans of zombies in early games. You can actually hear him as some of the zombies in Resident Evil 2, and even Shinji Mikami as some of the voices of zombies in the original. The first game was initially imagined as much bigger in scale, with whole entire extra mansions that were cut as the vision ran headlong into the various limits of budget, team size, and the memory capacity of the PS1. Like I said, at the time Capcom was nearly bankrupt, something they've only ever come close to once, according to speculation, after... Capcom is a big company with lots of different franchises, but the story of Resident Evil can be kept close to a surprisingly small crew. And while lots of factors can be attributed to why Resident Evil 5 and 6 are like that...
Mr. President!
One really simple thing we can point to is that they were literally made by different people. Ever since Resi 5, Capcom has been swapping out a lot of the team between each game, which has proven more effective in recent years as they released 4 of the best Resi games ever made. Yes, a lot of this video is going to be me fawning over how absurdly good 7 and 8 and the remakes of 2 and 3 are, and I make no apology for that because they fucking rock. They whip. They fuck. It's worth spending a long time talking about how good they are. Resident Evil 2 and 3 remake are hot girl shit, and I am going to prove it. But this is also going to be a technical breakdown. So for this episode, welcome to my game design laboratory. We're doing science. My game design laboratory may look like the other side of my living room, but trust me, science! To draw us into the world of game design, I want to ask a question. Is a scary gameplay moment part of the plot? Undeniably, it's important to your experience of a story, but is it part of the story? Let's start with an illuminating example. In Resident Evil 2 Remake, the interrogation room of the police station contains a two-way mirror. In Leon's playthrough, the mirror has already been smashed, but in Claire's playthrough, when you go into the interrogation room, it hasn't yet, and then of course it does. A liquor explodes out of the mirror and tries to do whatever that tongue do. With the game environment changing in the two playthroughs based on something that happens in one of them, it kind of feels silly to not say that this is part of the plot. So we're starting to think about how Resident Evil actually works. Lots of modern games work on making their enemy AI cleverer and balance the challenge for the player almost mathematically, programmatically spawning in new enemies. Not so in Resident Evil, not even in the most recent games or the remakes. Every enemy is placed carefully, lovingly, and there are a finite number of them. You could give names to every zombie in Raccoon City, and I'd probably be disappointed if I found out the developers didn't do that. Using our haunted house analogy from last time, this is no surprise. Every fright and scare has a lot of thought put into it. RE gameplay typically incorporates survival, horror, combat, and puzzles, but when you play one of these games over and over, the finite and carefully designed enemy encounters start to feel like their own constantly evolving puzzle, and you come to know the solutions so well that specific fights become quasi-plot points to your playthrough, and they kind of are, right? Somebody planned each and every encounter with every ghoul and goblin in the series. In Resident Evil 2, this is especially apparent, where each encounter with the liquor specifically is extremely tense and memorable. They even have their own musical theme. If you're familiar with my channel, you know I usually don't shut up about all these wacky ideas I have about how we shouldn't set fire to the planet, or cops shouldn't be allowed to murder people, and like the fruits of society should maybe be shared equally between its inhabitants. But this is the game design episode. The last essay in the series is the ideology of Resident Evil, so I'm going to be straining as hard as I can not to bring up politics in this one. CIA femboy, you pretend to be apolitical. How do you do that? Capitalism is the only system that supports catboys. Great. Let's talk about world design. Part 1. Raccoon City. Let's start by talking about the setting. It's good to think about the settings of Resident Evil games because in a very literal sense, game design is tied to the worlds that games are set in. But for Resident Evil, this is even more true than in other franchises. The original Resident Evil game came out in 1996. In 1996, games looked like this. And yet, somehow, in 1996, Resident Evil looked like this. The original Resident Evil, and in fact the whole original trilogy, were able to look so good through a little visual trickery. While the character models on screen were live 3D animation, everything else in shot is a pre-rendered background. This is the hidden reasoning behind Resident Evil's iconic fixed camera angles. Loading a pre-rendered background with some characters on it takes a lot less processing power than running a full live 3D environment, allowing the backgrounds to feature a lot more detail. Because of this approach, the designs of the mansion, the police station, and the rest of Raccoon City are all driven first and foremost by the enemy encounters, the puzzles, and the puzzle of the setting itself, because you almost never see a part of any of these settings that your character isn't currently standing in. In Fallout New Vegas or Cyberpunk 2077, you can go right out into the desert and see the city from far away. But in the original Resi trilogy, the only part of the world that ever exists is the bit right in front of you. Literally. The slight lag between shots is the computer loading in the next PowerPoint slide Leon Kennedy will dance around on top of. You can still today see a little of how the 3D design influenced the RPD of Resident Evil 2 versus the RPD of Resident Evil 2 Remake. The safe room at the bottom of the stairs that contains the dark room is surprisingly hard to find in the remake. I've seen players actually miss it altogether. And that's because in the original, when that safe room was put there was a camera pointed right at the door. It was impossible to miss. In the remake, when you control the camera, it's possible you ran out of that hallway where you just encountered 4 zombies, you saw the stairs, and legged it as fast as you could up to the next floor without even looking around. Missing one of the few places in the game where enemies can't follow you, and one of the rare places in the game where you can save your progress. Hey, CIA femboy, you have a take on this?
Twink rights!
Yeah, wait. What rights don't twinks have?
The right to have cops at Pride.
Uh-huh.
The right to work for private military contractors.
That's not true.
The right to enact a genocide against indigenous Guatemalans to protect the free market interests of a fruit company.
That's a real thing the CIA did.
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
In his superbly written atlas of the designed worlds that we explore in video games, titled Virtual Cities, Konstantinos Dimopoulos describes Raccoon City like this.
Nestled deep in the foggy but wonderful Arklay Mountains, Raccoon City was a typical American city of the Midwest. Surrounded by a craggy countryside of lakes, rivers, and ravines, as well as the old-growth raccoon forest, the city was part of nature's beautiful, diverse tapestry.
And I agree, there is something very organic feeling about Raccoon City.
It feels like it's a natural space that people really live in, and I think that part of that comes down to the way you progress through the whole thing as one big map. You never have to wait on loading screens between areas because every time you move across half a room, the game switches to a new fixed camera angle, revealing 2 more chompy boys for you to get killed by instantly. It seems like an interesting trade-off, the way the movement is hampered by the fixed camera angles versus the organic, free-flowing design of the world. But I think there's an argument to be made here that it's not a trade-off at all, but rather a trade-on. I'm trying to say fixed camera angles are good, actually. A lot of focus is put on fixed cameras as a tone setter in survival horror. Lack of control, building of tension, blah blah blah. However, this tends to describe the approach in videographic terms rather than ludological terms? Damn, I invented a word for video game science and it turns out it already exists. Isn't Latin fun? I mean that we talk about how fixed cameras make the game look instead of the impact that it has on how the gameplay feels, and that might sound like splitting hairs, but you'll probably understand better what I mean later. The fixed cameras make it more stressful to navigate the world because there could be a zombo right there where the shot changes, and that makes you move through the world slower, paying more attention to the environment, which they've been able to make look better because of the fixed camera angles, paying more attention to color, contrast, lighting, style, decor. The fixed camera angles and the design of the world feed into one another in a symbiotic cycle. It isn't a trade-off at all, it's a win-win. Konstantinos Dimopoulos goes on.
Raccoon City was originally mentioned in the first Resident Evil, but only visited by players in its 1998 sequel. Even then, little of the actual city was shown, but players and critics were too satisfied to notice. Building up the excitement apparently worked, as did the pre-rendered backgrounds that allowed for higher resolutions and greater detail than would have been possible in real-time 3D. These backgrounds lent the world its distinct feel and permitted controlled framing and the effective setting up of scares.
This is a recognizable feature of the way these games work. The gameplay drives the creation of the world. That might seem strange. If you were setting out creating Resident Evil 2, you might imagine the setting would come first, and all the puzzles and their pieces and the enemy encounters would get fitted into it. But game design is an iterative process. You might have the Raccoon City Police Department concept of the setting first, but the shape of the gameplay dictates the shape of the world.
What I like about the police station in Resi 2 is that it doesn't try to explain a chronology of what happened. It isn't the set of a murder mystery, spoon-feeding you clues to the timeline of events, just a place where people used to work. It's messy, it's chaotic, and it looks like it was abandoned in a hurry in order to form a defensive perimeter which then collapsed. As Konstantinos puts it,
Raccoon City feels like it actually existed before the zombies. It is deeper than a cardboard prop connecting indoor levels. Its varied zombies are representative of a wider population, and the few roads shown are rich in street furniture, architectural variety, and activity. They feel both typical and representative enough to paint images of a wider town before the catastrophe. Besides, the skyline of Raccoon City, glimpsed in the main menu, was modelled after Montreal. The vast police station, on the other hand, seems iconically odd, as it was housed in a former art museum in order to explain the bizarre puzzles scattered throughout the building. It is such overlapping influences, restrictions, and sensibilities that shaped Raccoon City, an intriguingly skewed vision of American Midwestern urbanism crafted by Japanese game developers using late 1990s technology under the influence of 1970s and 1980s zombie movies.
To the Game Design Lab! One element that can really help us unpack the difference between the designed worlds of Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, and 8 as opposed to the worlds of 5 and 6 is elevation. A lot of classical stories like to play with senses of elevation as well as distance, and this is something that can make the design of a fictional world incredibly compelling. In Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, the pilgrim starts at the middle point of the afterlife, and has to travel all the way down to the lowest part of hell before climbing all the way up into heaven. In Lord of the Rings, some of the darkest moments of the story take place underground, and the terminus of their adventure is a volcano. A mountain you first have to climb up and then throw the one ring down into. In the most philosophically significant work of the last 80 years, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, some of the nicest, goodest characters live on the ground level or beneath it, while the prince, the pinnacle of all evil, lives at the top of a skyscraper, which creates a sense the world is perfectly upside down, perverted and wrong because of the parasitic, vampire-like exploitation of the working class by the bourgeoisie. There are, however, reasons besides communism to play with elevation in your fictional worlds. There aren't really, but all the boys will stop watching unless I pretend they know a little more than me about this. How do video games even work? What does this button do? Ooh, did I win? In Resident Evil, you descend deeper into the chaos and madness of the Spencer Mansion, first hoping to escape, then pushing deeper through the secret facilities underneath, and finally arriving at the lab, where you're shown the ultimate life form, making the fight with the Tyrant the final barrier between the subterranean evil of the mansion and your airborne escape by helicopter. In Resident Evil 2, you explore the police station, open an underground passage to the car park, travel further down into the sewers, and then the Umbrella facilities beneath the city. In Nemesis, you're chased across the city by the Chonky Lad, reinforcing the sense that nowhere on the surface of the city is safe now that the T-Virus has bubbled up out of the sewers and onto the streets. And once again, you find yourself in a deep underground facility at the end of the game. Speaking of subterranean horror, the original Resi 3 had giant worms. I keep telling you, this is a franchise for women! Not to belabor this point unendingly, I just want to point out one more small example. In Resident Evil Village, the village itself is the neutral elevation, and each boss exists in an area not too far from the village as the crow flies, but on quite different elevations. For example, Lady Dimitrescu and Heisenberg absolutely fucking loathe each other, and Castle Dimitrescu is, well, a castle, while Heisenberg's factory sits in a massive chasm in the earth, creating a physical sense that both characters are powerful and important, but in opposing ways. That isn't even the example I meant to talk about though, there are just so many of these. In Donna Beneviento's house, when you unlock all of the escape room puzzles, but before you activate the Nightmare Baby, you have to climb down into a well. It's a dead end in the earth, a deep, narrow, claustrophobic chamber, and clearly a bit of an homage to The Ring. The game is building your sense of dread proportionally to how far down in the level you go. The point is, playing with elevation can give something a real sense of significance. The first 3 games take you deep underground. Resi 4 ends with a fight on top of a castle. Elevation isn't everything, but it is key to a lot of the series' world design. So when a game gives you a wide open flat level where you just ride around on a hoverboat hunting down black people, Resident Evil 5 is really racist. It bears repeating. But it's also boring and bad to play. And which of those is a greater crime? Who can say? It's the racism. Resi 5 starts in a city, then travels to tribal wetlands, and then wildly whips back and forth between oil fields and the exploitative neocolonialism of petrol companies and Indiana Jonesy puzzle temples. Chapter 5 is more or less just 5 consecutive boss fights, and yes, some of them take place in an underground umbrella facility, but all the significance is killed by a combination of neither knowing nor caring what it is you're fighting, and the fact there are just so many bosses in a row. More like Resident Evil 5 bosses in a row! Got him! Chapter 6 takes place on a boat, then on a plane, and then the plane crash lands inside the crater of an active volcano where Wesker, much like the One Ring, is shot from a helicopter by 2 CIA agents with rocket launchers. It's a mess. Where's the progression? Like I said, elevation isn't everything, but it and all the other issues are tied closely together in the same way they would be tied together well in a game that worked. In the other games, the feeling of progression that the elevation and other design elements give you make you feel like you're moving up a chain of power. Police station, police chief, secret experiments, umbrella corporation. Evil cult, monster cultists, evil prince, mutated cult leader. In Resident Evil 5, on the other hand, you just go from one place to another place to another place to another place. There are 2 car turret fights back to back, and in the second one, the car isn't even moving. You just go wherever the fuck the game decides you're going, and then, at the end, Chris Redfield punches a fucking boulder. Chris Redfield punches a boulder in a volcano. And it's not even to defeat Wesker, it's just to make a stepping stone for Shiva to jump on.
The human race requires judgment!
Resident Evil 6, likewise, is a mess.
Oh, did you see me slide over that? Oh, yeah, you did love that.
Whoa! Whoa! Oh, shit!
There are clear design intentions you can tease out. For instance, in Leon's playthrough you start low and end high, and in Chris's playthrough you start high and end low, and the crossover point is where the 2 men find Ada Wong. It's like poetry. It rhymes. However, Chris's playthrough starts at the top of a Chinese tenement building and works downwards, but then cuts to a flashback to Eastern Europe, where the level design is almost completely flat. In a series that's notorious for its deep underground labyrinths, the flatness of the level tells you immediately not to give the slightest fuck about this place, and this is supposed to be where you find out Chris's entire motivation. The intentions were there, but there is absolutely no consistency or coherent design ethos. Jake and Sherry's story is the most extreme version of this, going up and down into different countries, simply wherever the story needs them to be to interact with the other characters, rather than having any kind of structure of its own. Ada's playthrough, which should be the one that ties everything together, revealing the deepest truths of the political corporate conspiracy, also just kinda goes wherever. The game that should have given the most concrete sense of the world of Resident Evil instead makes it harder to believe that Resident Evil takes place in one coherent world setting at all. If you ignore Resi 5 and 6, it's actually easier to believe that Resident Evil takes place in one contiguous world because the world design ethos is the same. And now a word on behalf of our sponsors. The whole Resimania series is sponsored by Boxu. Boxu is a Japanese snack subscription service that sends you a monthly package of Japanese snacks. Naturally, when they got in touch, I thought they'd be a perfect fit for this series. Ooh. It has this handy leaflet that tells you about all the snacks you're getting, and it actually tells you where they come from as well. I'm gonna have some of these apple gummies. They taste kind of like apple pie. Actually, the smell is just, like, overwhelming. I kept the packet around for ages because, like, the smell is just so nice. Boxy makes such a perfect and memorable gift for anyone in your life who appreciates Japanese food and culture, especially in a time when people aren't able to travel the world as easily as they would like. And actually, American subscribers to Boxu will be getting the chance to win free tickets to Japan because Boxu is holding a giveaway. They'll be picking one lucky US-based winner for a free set of tickets, and anyone who subscribed before the 31st of December is entered automatically, even if it's a gift subscription. This is one of these ones I really appreciate getting Japanese snacks for. It's a melon chocolate biscuit. It's cantaloupe flavored, and it goes so nicely. It's sweet and refreshing and delicious. Do you live in the US? Do you love snacks? My YouTube analytics tell me at least one of those is quite likely. So if you want the chance to win free tickets to Japan, or just to try these great snacks, use my code MARS10 or the link in the description and you'll get 10% off your subscription. Don't miss out on this great opportunity for anyone who subscribes before December 31st. Resident Evil settings are campy, schlocky, and fun, with horror lurking just beneath the surface. They draw together unrelated aesthetics and ideas in ways that make them make sense together. A carnival of hillbilly horror, or gothic horror, or bioweapon horror. A haunted house with a motivating theme. These aren't the only settings of the main series, though, because as it happens, Resident Evil 4 was in development for 6 years, and in that time, the team developed several iterations of the game, overhauling the entire world several times in between. So, before we move on completely from world design, I think we ought to talk about Part 1.5, 4 Resident Evils. Speaking to GameSpy about Resi 4 and its previous iterations, Hiroyuki Kobayashi, producer on both Resident Evil 4 and Devil May Cry, said,
"The first story idea we had was going in to destroy the main base of Umbrella in Europe. The second concept was that Leon was hit with a bizarre disease in which he started to see illusions and monsters that weren't really there. He would attack and strike out at them, but he couldn't do them any harm. The third version had zombies. It simply didn't feel fun. Then we said, no more zombies, and that was that."
This is a pretty good summary, but you need to know there were actually 4 versions of Resident Evil 4, not 3, and it's important to talk about all of them. The version that Kobayashi didn't mention here is the cool version. Okay, so I call the first version of Resident Evil 4 they were making the cool version because of something funny I saw on Wikipedia. It's not something the developers were ever actually calling the game. On Wikipedia, it says the original version was going to be more cool, and that eventually Shinji Mikami stepped in to say that Resident Evil isn't supposed to be cool, and that's when the project spun off and became Devil May Cry instead. If you dig into the sources, that's not what anyone actually said, and Mikami's problem was with the action-oriented format the game was taking, and the lack of exploration or puzzles compared with the previous games. There's the lesson, kids. Don't believe everything you read on Wikipedia. That said, this cool version was going to be a big departure, and Resi 4 probably wouldn't be what it is today if it weren't for the cool version. The protagonist, Tony, was, as opposed to cop protagonists in previous installments, going to be someone with special powers gained from Umbrella's experiments, and his bombastic combat maneuvers weren't showcased well in fixed camera angles, so the team decided to leave the iconic pre-rendered backgrounds of the franchise behind, and opt for a dynamic camera system instead. Resident Evil so meaningfully shaped the survival horror genre, and Resident Evil 4 so meaningfully reshaped it, that I think it's fair to say here that the genre as a whole owes something to the cool version. Part of what was happening here, it seems, was that Shinji Mikami was beginning the process of moving on from Resident Evil and trying to hand over directorial and creative duties to other staff, but at the same time couldn't completely remove himself from the project. This first cool version that became Devil May Cry was directed by Hideki Kamiya, but when it got underway, Mikami felt it just didn't fit with the world of Resident Evil they had built so far, and so Kamiya took the project to Capcom and rebranded it as Devil May Cry. It's interesting to note for the discussion of world design that knowing they were giving Leon Kennedy a fun little European gap year, members of the dev team spent 11 days in Spain and the UK taking pictures of statues and architecture for texture references. I hope they got to try a Wigan kebab. The next version of the game retained some of the previous elements while starting to move a little closer to what we're familiar with. The protagonist was now Leon, and he would have a sidekick, and in the game he would be in the main headquarters of Umbrella in Europe. This fits in well with the established lore, because in Resident Evil 2 you can actually find a note explaining where Chris has gone, where he says he's in Europe dating hot chicks, but on a closer reading, the message is clearly code for a mission he's on investigating Umbrella Corp. Having Leon infiltrate Umbrella as well could have worked really well by continuing the franchise pattern of having the protagonists just barely miss each other and never quite link up. In this version, Leon was also infected with the virus, giving him special powers like Tony. This version wasn't officially scrapped or spun off, but rather iterated upon, leading to the Hookman version. In 2005, when Resident Evil 4 finally shipped, pre-order copies included a playable demo of an earlier version of the game, which had been shown off at E3 way back in 2003. The demo has Leon traversing some sort of old building with fancy decor and old paintings, as the building comes to life and attacks him with suits of armor, dolls, a mounted stag's head, and finally, as a painting of a man holding a large meat hook comes to life and chases him around the level. This is the Hookman version, and honestly, Resident Evil 9 should be Hookman. I'm just saying what everyone else here is thinking. I've become a Hookman stan now. Give me that hooky, stabby, spooky boy. In the Hookman version, Leon sees everything in a bluer hue when the house comes to life and attacks him, making it unclear if he's really lucid or in some kind of dream, and something I find really interesting is that one of the scares in the demo are living dolls. I said before that Beneviento's house and village didn't seem to have a clear gothic horror inspiration, but have we just found the inspiration here? Capcom, please, if you turned the spooky doll nightmare house from the Hookman version into Beneviento, I am begging you, please put Hookman in Resident Evil 9. The developers said there wasn't really a fully fleshed out backstory to Hookman or the setting, and that makes sense because it seems like the developers were just playing with different mechanics and preparing the technology while the writers worked on the setting and story. The other really compelling thing about the Hookman version is that it's literally a haunted house, and I cannot tell you how vindicating that is. However, it might have been the literal haunting of this setting, which was its downfall. It was actually Shinji Mikami who insisted that in the original Resident Evil, nothing would have a supernatural origin. Everything would come from Umbrella's laboratories. So, this is just my speculation, but it could be that the more paranormal, ghostlier feel of the Hookman version might have been why it didn't go anywhere. Which is why you have to hire me to write it. I have everything figured out, and there's a scientific explanation for everything. It starts when Hookman's lover is tragically killed. The fourth iteration of Resident Evil 4 before it was actually released saw Leon infiltrating not Umbrella's headquarters, but instead the castle of Oswald Spencer, the wealthy eugenicist whose mansion you explore in Resident Evil 1. Again, Leon was going to have a young female sidekick, but something pretty special about this version was that the two of them were also going to be accompanied by a zombie dog. Would the dog have been cute? Hypothetically, a cute Frankenstein dog? I can see that working. Would Leon have been able to pet the dog? Now we're asking the really important questions. This setting where two protagonists explore Oswald Spencer's castle, of course, is actually the premise of a Resident Evil 5 DLC, where Jill and Chris go to confront Spencer and Wesker, and then Jill is MIA, presumed dead, but actually is booby mind control crystal. Of course, in Resident Evil 5, all of this is communicated by flashback unless you play the DLC, so I'm wondering why they didn't stick to this premise for Resident Evil 4. So, what did we learn from all this extra detail about scrapped games that they never made? I don't know. I write the script, I make all the jokes, I edit the video. Do I have to draw your conclusions for you too? Jesus! Part 2. Resource and Inventory Management. When you've played a few of these games, and you can see the ways in which the good ones are good and the bad ones are bad, an incontrovertible statement begins to form in your mind. Resident Evil has a rhythm. What makes a good Resident Evil game good? I hope we'll get an answer to that on a quite technical level today, but a nice, quick, fun, sexy answer is the ones that are good are so good because they have the rhythm. What do I mean by that? Let's take an example. In Resi 2 Remake, you get the red book to put in the statue's hand, to get the scepter to retrieve the jewel, to put in the box to get the police badge, to activate the computer to open the armory in the STARS office. In the STARS office, there's a battery which goes in the detonator, which knocks down the wall, which gets you the statue puzzle, which you solve for the third medallion, allowing you to open the secret underground passage from the police station to the parking lot. Those are two short sets of steps which lead you to a weapon upgrade and a new area to explore. Game progression is made possible by you completing steps which will not always be consecutive or available one after another, but linked together in a satisfying way. It comes to feel a lot like cooking a complicated meal. Several steps are required to make a sauce which is itself one part of one dish, and if you have the timings perfectly figured out, you find yourself dancing around the kitchen through what should be a daunting task in a way that is instead exciting and fun. In reality, the red jewel can't be fitted into the box to retrieve the police badge until you get into the observation room. If you're playing as Claire, you can't go in the observation room until that sweet licky boy busts through the two-way mirror at you in the interrogation room. If you're playing as Leon, you get into the observation room with the club club key. You do it different ways depending on your playthrough, but the item is withheld until a certain point in the game either way round, meaning that the steps I described before can't be completed in that order by the player. You have to have opened the secret passage and completed the parking lot story before you can get the Bejeweled box, so you can see already how finding your way through all of this, even when you know every solution to every puzzle, is quite challenging. But the keen viewer will have also noticed that every solution involves some kind of item. You get the thing to take to the place, to do the thing, to get the whatever, to open the blah blah blah. The club key I just mentioned even is one of 4 card suit styled keys that open specific doors around the station. And here's the thing about items. They take up inventory slots. If you have 8 inventory slots and need to carry your pistol, knife, spare ammo, several different keys, the items that solve puzzles, boards to board up windows to stop zombies coming in, and a little green herb to make yourself feel better, you can see the issue, right? And realistically, your pistol does nothing against lickers, so you want to carry the shotgun or the grenade launcher, which are long items, so they take up 2 inventory slots instead of 1. Inventory might not seem important, but the size of your inventory is literally the restriction which creates that sense of rhythm. This is something the franchise has played with since day 1. In the original, Chris's playthrough was labelled hard and Jill's playthrough was labelled easy, and there were few mechanical differences between them because the simple but monumental difference between them was that Chris only has 6 inventory slots and Jill has 8. Look who doesn't have pockets now, men! The 2 and 3 remakes give you extra pouches to increase your inventory 2 slots at a time throughout the game, from a minimum 8 up to a maximum of 20. At the same time, the game keeps giving you new kinds of enemies to fight, and each new kind of enemy needs a new kind of weapon. As you navigate the Spencer Mansion, the Raccoon City police station, the streets of Raccoon City, the Baker family home, or Eastern Europe, you catch little glimpses of how that rhythm should go, little bits that make the puzzle pieces lock nicely together, but the eternal challenge is the balance of your weapons, ammo, items, and inventory. If you know the complete playthrough and can reliably defeat every enemy in the game, you can take part in the dance, experience the beautiful totality of the rhythm. But if you can't, either because of your own skill as a player or the design of one of the games, it can be frustrating in an unpleasant way. A lot of people, for instance, get stuck in the RPD parking lot because new items aren't readily apparent and the steps to open the next area for exploration aren't as clear as they are in the rest of the game. The dance that should go, enter the new area, clear out the enemies, pick up the items, figure out what they do, solve the puzzles, rinse and repeat, gets stuck somewhere between steps 3 and 4. In the comments, a lot of people pointed out after the last video that I didn't talk about Resident Evil 0 despite claiming to be covering the main series of games, and that's because Resident Evil 0 is a piss little game for clowns and babies. Clown babies. A garbage game for hogs. That's not my real take. I don't think Resident Evil 0 is particularly bad or good. It's not Resident Evil 6, it's cut from the same cloth as 1, 2, and 3, and it's certainly no Code Veronica. But let's talk about why some people don't like it. And in particular, let's talk about why I think those people don't understand what they don't like about it. In Resident Evil 0, in the training facility area, once you get the fire key, you open the fire key doors. So you can go to the study, so you can move the table. So you can stand on the table, so you can reach the moose head. So you can retrieve the iron needle, so you can solve the clock puzzle. So you can go in the clock puzzle doors, so you can get microfilm A, so you can get microfilm B. So you can combine the microfilms, so you can get the MO disc. So that you can put the MO disc into the podium and solve the desk puzzle, so you can open the night doors. So you can go to the chess room, so you can solve the chess puzzle, so that you can get the Book of Evil, so you can retrieve the black statue wings, so you can construct the black statue, balancing the scales, allowing you to move to the next area. As much as it might sound like I'm just listing things the same way I was before, in a good Resident Evil game, you should complete short phrases of puzzle solving that allow some flexibility, or at least the illusion of it. Because you could either solve the painting riddle or find the parrot's missing beak, you both feel free to do whichever you want first and enjoy the challenge of inventory management. Choke points are rarer because the player almost always has multiple options for what to do. In Resident Evil 0, you're almost always just trying to solve the next puzzle to progress the next stage with no overlap or flexibility, and with that the challenge of inventory management disappears as well. Why worry about what you're carrying if the miscellaneous items you have on you will almost definitely be exactly what you need for the next puzzle? In Noah's video, Noah says what I've seen a lot of people who dislike this game say, that Resident Evil 0 is bad because it's silly. It has an opera singer mind-controlling leeches on a train, and yes, that is silly. But with all due respect to the OG, I think Noah is wrong here. Opera singer mind-controlling leeches is silly in exactly the same way that all of Resident Evil is silly all the time. In Resi 2 Remake, you're chased by a giant alligator in the sewer. In Resi 3 Remake, the massive, bulbous head of the toy uncle rolls down the hill and nearly crushes you. In Resident Evil 4, there's a quick-time event where you sprint away from a 30-foot statue of a 4-foot man. In Resident Evil Village, Heisenberg... None of these things are seen as detractors from the franchise the same way I unironically love when the snake busts up through the toilet in Hard Ticket to Hawaii, and then Ron Moss drives through the wall on his motorbike and shoots it in the head with a rocket launcher. I would argue this isn't an aesthetic issue at all, but instead that magical rhythm simply isn't there. The wonderful dance of gameplay that makes a Resident Evil game just right is missing from Resident Evil 0, and it has a lot to do with inventory management. If the leech singer had been in a game that got the rhythm right, we would all unanimously agree that it is very silly, but doesn't detract from the game. Joseph Anderson regularly says that gameplay is king, and as serious and political as my hyper-pretentious commie trans girl media analysis gets, it's hard for me to disagree there. That's why I'm paying so much attention to game design in this episode. Gameplay is king, and it's the experience of the gameplay that shapes your experience of the game first and foremost. Next episode, for instance, I will spend an inadvisable amount of time talking about Resident Evil 5 and 6 in a positive light, because I'll be analysing the franchise politically. But there's no way round where I could ever call either of them good games, because they simply are piss and or ass to play. They just suck. In an incredibly ironic move, the silly and contrived fiction of Resident Evil 0 is a perfect reflection of the real problem. The game takes place in a second, but very similar mansion in the Arklay Mountains, right next to the Spencer Mansion. It's a pale imitation of the Spencer Mansion in the way that Resident Evil 0 is a pale imitation of what makes a good Resident Evil game good. It feels like they had a lot of bits and pieces on the cutting room floor and wanted to make a prequel to increase the hype for Resident Evil Remaster, so just stuck them all together end to end with no thought to the rhythm of the dance. Resident Evil Code Veronica... Uh-oh, here we go again. I'm sorry.
The human race requires judgment!
Resident Evil Code Veronica, among other kinds of massive dumpster fires, is a massive dumpster fire of game design too, in the biblical sense, the Cyberpunk 2077 sense. The game is actually broken in at least a couple of extraordinary ways that anyone should have noticed if anyone was checking. Famously, a late-game solution requires you to have a fire extinguisher item which you plausibly left in a puzzle that demands all of your metal items really early in the game, and if you didn't have the foresight to think you might need a fire extinguisher later, then the game becomes uncompletable at this incredibly late stage. In real life, of course, a fire extinguisher is a very important item in a crisis. In Resident Evil, you have no way of knowing whether it will be more important than the pirate's wooden leg or the pocket watch shaped like a dinosaur. Another problem, an outright glitch on some platforms, is caused by an item called the Player Manual. The Player Manual is a book that tells you how to play the game because fuck you and fuck intuitive self-explanatory play experiences, I guess. It's an item that takes up an inventory slot. Despite actually being a file, you can also read in your Files tab, and that causes its own problem with players who don't realize they have an inventory slot taken up by a completely unnecessary item for most of the game. But it also causes a problem when the game gets confused by the item, which is also a file. When the player goes into the File tab to read the Player Manual as a file, the game deletes the manual, but the next selected item after the manual for some reason becomes inexpendable. In other words, when you use the item, it doesn't disappear. So in a game where, at least in theory, inventory management matters a lot, a bug makes it possible to either wind up with a permanently occupied slot you can never empty, or literally infinite ammo or healing items. This bug is pretty funny and would be a little game-breaking in most games that have inventory at all, but I hope I've explained the delicate balance of inventory and resource management enough now that you understand why this is especially bad in a Resident Evil game. Inventory management isn't something I thought I would ever actively enjoy, but somehow Resident Evil at its best makes deciding what should be in your inventory actually fun. Like at the end of Resi 2 Remake, when Leon gets to a slow-moving elevator on which he will have his final battle with Mr. X, the elevator needs a special type of fuse plug to work. The same is true for Claire and her big battle with Eyeball William Birkin. The thing is, the fight will start as soon as you use the plug, and the plug takes up 2 inventory slots, and here, after everything, faced with this, I felt elated. I never thought I would actively enjoy inventory management, but Resident Evil 2 Remake showed me how wrong I could be. Okay, let's talk about ammunition and guns. Guns are hot, but Cox leftoids don't want anybody to have them. So you support community self-defense then? Why are you promoting terrorism? I swear to God I will send you back to Twitter and get a refund. I'll come back as an NFT and be more powerful than you could possibly imagine. You know the thing I worry about with making videos this long is, what if there's someone who's watching who's just having a really bad time? Like, what if there's someone who's watching right now who's just fucking seething because they think my video game opinions are so bad, but for some reason they think they have to watch the rest of it? To that person, hey, you don't have to do this. Go do something you like instead. Call your best friend and see how they're doing. On the face of it, weapons and ammunition seem like a pretty simple game design element. If you want to make a game harder, give the player less ammo and make each bullet do less damage. Simple. Still, here, Resident Evil manages to innovate. In many games, different weapons do different things. For instance, crowd control for stunning or even taking out many enemies at once, long range versus short range for different combat arenas, elemental buffs and debuffs. Nonetheless, the weapon progression remains pretty simple. At the start, your basic weapon is okay at killing basic enemies. At the end, you have the mega weapon that's okay at killing the boss monster, or really good at killing 12 basic enemies at once. In Resident Evil, weapons are far more locked to specific enemies. Plant monsters and lickers don't give the slightest fuck about your shitty little toy pistol, Leon. Put that shit away! On the other hand, plants are weak to fire, and lickers are weak to acid, both of which Claire has in her big girl gun, the grenade launcher.
Oh, baby, a triple!
In Resident Evil 4, Leon encounters a special type of regenerating zombie that seemingly has no weak spots. That is, until you view it through an infrared scope, when you realize the living organism has these little organs randomly placed around the body that you can take out with one hit, provided you hit them exactly on target. This is such a cool idea, and takes your rifle, an already precious high-powered weapon, and makes it 10 times more precious as a resource, because now it's the only weapon that can kill this specific, really shitty enemy. The game even acknowledges this outright a little later on by giving you one of these guys that you have to get past and covering him with spikes, so if you don't shoot him right in his weak spots, you're fucked. This was such a cool idea that when the plant monsters were redesigned for the Resi 2 remake, they included similar little organs on the bodies you can shoot if you don't have any kind of incendiary weapons, and if you hit them just right, it takes them out. You, however, are probably panicking and won't spot them, because a zombie made of trees is coming to bite your head off. In Resi 3, the original and the remake, the weapon you use to kill Nemesis once and for all is a special Umbrella prototype energy weapon, because the developers know that giving each type of enemy its own special weapon makes the enemy more special, and of course Nemesis, the most special boy ever to live, deserves a gun that's just for him. It's also, however, an extension of this philosophy that aiming and shooting and combat should all be part of a puzzle. And so Nemesis gets his own gun, which is itself a puzzle, because so are all weapons, and so is everything. Everything in the game is a facet of the big puzzle, which is the game itself. Resident Evil 0, 1, 2, 3, Code Veronica, and 7 all used storage boxes, which can be accessed at various points and always contain everything you left in any of them. This works to facilitate the more puzzle-focused gameplay, because you never know when the mayor's shoe is going to turn out to fit into the cobbler's door puzzle and open the next area, so it makes inventory management a fun challenge. Resident Evils 4 and Village use a primary and secondary inventory system where the main inventory that the player has access to is backed up by a second inventory they can only access when talking to a merchant. This is because those games are far more combat focused, and as a result, inventory management isn't something that's meant to be fun in them. You just buy more inventory space when you need it, and managing your inventory is never really a concern. With that, however, the joy of managing your inventory is never really a possibility. And to me, that's sad. But what's all this about merchants? Money? Buying? Combat-focused gameplay? That sounds bad and scary, and not like Resident Evil to me. I think it's time to talk about Part 3, Video Game Economics. Way too many games now have economies because they want to sell you stuff. Part 4, Speedrun. Okay, seriously, even if it can be summed up really simplistically, this is a very interesting topic. In the last 10 to 20 years, we've experienced a lot of changes in gaming. Some of them expected, better graphics, more striving towards 3D realism, others less expected. For example, why do so many people now like to play games where they work? Isn't that a contradiction? A work game? And yet, job simulators are more popular today than they've ever been. Since the beginning of video games, many games have put the player in the shoes of the character with a particular profession, often police or military, and, not to leave it unsaid, plumber. But these games don't focus on the nature of the work, and many of them deviate from the player character's job altogether. Some of the earliest work simulators, one could argue at least, were games that let people explore the fantasy of having a really cool job where the player has a lot of power and agency, like Roller Coaster Tycoon or Sim City. But what's really curious about this trend is a move towards jobs that don't offer any obvious power fantasy. There are now not only games that allow us to design our ideal theme park or city, but games that simulate being a truck driver, train driver, farmer, or courier. For my part, I think I can offer an insight from the perspective of someone who does a job for which there exists a job simulator. Yes, there is a YouTuber simulator. And while in some respects it does simulate the work and life of a content creator, the uneasy feeling I get thinking about it might tie in to what people like about this type of game. I feel quite bad thinking about all the labour that I put into my job being sold as a fun experience to be played, although I should maybe acknowledge a chip I probably have on my shoulder here. I do get told by people that my job is too easy and that I get paid too much, and in reality I haven't had a full day off in months, and I barely cover the expenses of a two-person household, even with all the money I get from Patreon, Twitch, AdSense, and very rare sponsors. All of my gripes and grievances are because I find the idea that someone would try out even a pale facsimile of my job for fun quite insulting. I'm sure there are truck drivers who feel the same way about Truck Driver Simulator, of course. But to resolve the apparent contradiction of games where you work, and this tension around job simulators, I think we need to talk a little about what fun even means. We have an idea based in a layman's understanding of neurochemistry that fun is kind of this thing that happens, right? You get a reward or succeed in some way and your brain gives you dopamine, at least in theory. But if that were the case, why have a game at all? Why not just have the end screen? Mario gets the princess every time, 10 out of 10, perfect game. Remember to like and subscribe! Why isn't Animal Crossing just a mall where you have infinite money? Well, because the rewards themselves aren't what make us happy. The nice thing about home decor in Animal Crossing is the challenge of decorating your house the way that you want, and even more so when each adornment requires you to spend hours farming, fishing, building, etc. Because the experience of fun is in the game itself rather than in the reward. In the utopia of rules, on technology, stupidity, and the secret joys of bureaucracy, the extremely smart-pilled and quotable champ, late great David Graeber, writes,
Western intellectual traditions have always tended to assume that humans' powers of reason exist, first and foremost, as a way of restraining our baser instincts. The assumption can already be found in Plato and Aristotle, and was strongly reinforced when classical theories of the soul were adopted into Christianity and Islam. Yes, the argument went, we all have animalistic drives and passions, just as we have our powers of creativity and imagination, but these impulses are ultimately chaotic and antisocial. Reason, whether in the individual or the political community, exists to keep our lower nature in check, to repress, channel, and contain potentially violent energies in such a way that they do not lead to chaos and mutual destruction. The emergence of bureaucratic populism, as I've been describing it, corresponds to a complete reversal of this conception of rationality, to a new ideal, one most famously summed up by David Hume, that reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. Rationality, in this view, has nothing to do with morality. It is a purely technical affair, an instrument, a machine, a means of calculating how to most efficiently achieve goals that could not themselves be in any way assessed in rational terms. Reason cannot tell us what we should want. It can only tell us how best to get it.
In essence, it's fun to manage to do complicated or stressful things, and that's a huge part of video games in general. From an analytical perspective, we often talk about concepts of fantasy and power in games, but from a design perspective, those aren't really very useful concepts. Instead, designers like to think about the feelings you want to elicit in a player and how the balance of challenge and reward creates those feelings. The kind of stress that this challenge creates is the flip side of the satisfaction that we get from labor. The good feelings that you get when you clean or gather up fruits or build something are counterbalanced by the stress of a messy, chaotic world. Okay, but what does this all have to do with economies? And what does this have to do with Resident Evil? Game genres are usually named for core mechanics, and Resident Evil is a survival horror franchise. Horror is when the game makes you afraid, but what are survival mechanics? You could try saying they're mechanics that mediate whether or not the player character is alive, but health is a prime example of that, and yet lots of games that aren't survival games have health as a mechanic. I think the best way to define it is that the balance between the challenge of surviving and the reward of progression through the game is the core focus of the gameplay. Survival as a mechanic is the labor of staying alive. You could think of it like a job simulator, where the job is not to get munched by a zombie. So, video game economics. Economies exist in video games wherever resources are exchanged between parties. In Prey, the item recycler is a kind of economy, because your resources are converted and exchanged and you get a different resource back. Along the same lines, skill points that can be spent fungibly into a skill tree are a kind of video game economy. There is a mechanical bleed between experience points and video game currency, where a lot of games will let you spend the points that you got in a level on rewards, whether the game calls those points currency or not. Video game economies are complex and wide-ranging, and in some cases extremely predatory, where the economy is priming players for spending real, actual money on in-game purchases, where their real money translates into video game currency which cannot translate back. Here, however, thankfully, that is not the case. Economy actually comes from a Greek word for household management, and in this regard, I think it's interesting to see how economies within games interplay with inventory management. Specifically in Resident Evil, games tend to either be more inventory management and puzzle focused, or more combat focused and feature explicit trade with currency. Remember the 6 slots that Chris Redfield had in Resident Evil 1? Well, in Resident Evil 4, Leon has 1, 2, 3, 4... a lot! Looking at this, it's safe to say the puzzle of inventory management is now a thing of the past, and yet it is still possible to run out of space. If you do so and want more, you have to see the most delightful character in the game.
Welcome.
The Vendor, a bafflingly cockney man in deep rural Spain wearing a face mask and a hooded trench coat, is an iconic example of Resident Evil camp, a character who exists only to give a face and voice
What are you buying?
to the economy mechanics, and yet instantly a fan favorite.
What are you selling?
Likewise, in Resident Evil Village, there is a jolly rotund fellow called the Duke, who operates a traveling pop-up shop just like the Vendor, which appears wherever you go and allows you to top up ammo, upgrade guns, buy more inventory space, sell unnecessary items, and even improve your character stats. Consider that in Resident Evil Village there are puzzles you can complete to give you big crystals which sell for a lot of money, allowing you to upgrade your inventory size or make other significant changes. This is remarkably similar to puzzles in the remakes, which you solve in order to get extra slots in your inventory. In Resident Evil 4, as opposed to previous games, enemies drop items when they die, which are determined in part by random chance. When you boot up Nemesis on normal mode, there are a precise number of handgun bullets you can get through the entire game. Not so in Resi 4 or Resi Village. Interestingly, although the games haven't strayed into the toxic, predatory world of in-game purchases, randomized item drops do rely on a similar game logic to gambling. And we could go into how this kind of game psychology is inherent to games that bring currency and trade mechanics in. However, what I'd like to focus on is that in Resi there is clearly a push and pull between inventory management and economy mechanics, and that this is tied closely to a push and pull between puzzle and combat. And if we're going to acknowledge that, I'm just going to say it outright. Economy mechanics aren't fun. Inventory management can be fun, currency management cannot. People don't like to be overly critical of Resident Evil 4, and I'm aware that I already have been, and I'm trying not to burn through my goodwill with the Resi fandom, But at the same time, I think it's extremely worth our while to consider the ways that the design of 4 led to the design of 5, which led to the design of 6.
The human race requires judgment!
In other words, to what extent is everyone's favourite Resi responsible for the crimes against gaming that came afterwards? In particular, I'm talking about the vendor. I'm sorry, comrades, but you knew this capitalist dog was going to get it eventually, no matter how funny his accent is.
What are you selling?
In RE4, there was the vendor, a thinly veiled in-universe explanation for the currency and purchasing that had been added. In RE5, the thin veil has blown away like a tissue in a hurricane, and the economy mechanics simply appear between each level with no diegetic explanation. On top of that, RE5 was co-op, and added a lot of new mechanics to the base of 4 to accommodate that. Resi 6 threw yet another boatload of additional unnecessary mechanics on top of that. With the push and pull between puzzles and inventory management versus combat and economy mechanics, I think we can pretty solidly argue that Resi 4, 5, and 6 are an observable progression of feature creep, leading to the awful bloated mess that nearly killed the entire franchise. We'll talk about this more later, but Village clearly recycles a lot from 4, and while it is itself a masterpiece just like 4 was, I find myself asking, is my favourite large sun the beginning of the end? Is the Duke a herald of an oncoming progression of feature creep in this new Resident Evil trilogy? Are video game economies bad? Well, capitalist ones are, yes. I was really expecting some kind of response from CIA femboy for that one. I'm an anarchist. What? Since when? Socialism can exist with markets, but tankies don't admit that. The only problem with capitalism is monopolies. That's not what anarchist means. The problem with the left today is... What? What? I'm a leftist. You literally work for the CIA. I'm still a human being! Jesus Christ. Examining the difference between what makes inventory management in Resident Evil fun and what makes economy mechanics distinctly less so reveals the core thesis of design philosophy here. Inventory management, like a job simulator, is fun because it's a little stressful in a specific way that you can master and draw satisfaction from. You are succeeding at the job of not getting munched, and that feels good. When, however, you get currency, be it money or points, for shooting zombos, only to spend that money on more big gun and more space to fit more bigger gun in, the stress has been designed out. You're not supposed to think about it, and yet you still have to. You still have to make decisions about what to spend your currency on, and in creeps a new kind of stress. This stress, however, isn't fun. This is the paralysis of choice stress. This is the what if I spend my money badly stress. The sold my soul to the company store stress. This isn't the rewarding challenge of a skill that can be mastered. This is the nagging feeling that whatever you do, you could have done something better, but not in a way that you understand. There's nothing there to get good at, but the game still makes you think about it long enough to doubt yourself. I say that this gets at the core of the design because everything in Resident Evil is a finely woven balance between frustration and progression. Resident Evil isn't a franchise that takes you on a roller coaster of different emotions. Instead, it's a bit more like Dark Souls. There's one feeling all the time, but it feels really good. It's a bit like a job simulator feeling, but more extreme. It's like you paid off all your debts to Tom Nook in Animal Crossing, turned around and said, okay, now give me the hard stuff. That's the feeling. It's the rhythm. It's the stressful fun of Resident Evil and the labor of survival horror. It feels so good to get it right because that feeling is all about discovering a new set of skills and then mastering them. And the absolute peak of those feelings is Part 4, speedrunning. Let's talk a bit more about stressful fun. I've been talking for
insert video length here
about Resident Evil game design now, and a clear emerging pattern is that where other games employ a balance between challenge and progression, Resident Evil uses challenge in harmony with progression. It's like what I talked about with the fixed camera angles before, a symbiotic relationship between how stressful a game is and how fun a game is. Being a Resident Evil fan is a little like the perfect relationship. Even when it's stressful, it's a little bit fun too. But ladies, if your man is constantly boring you with Call of Duty aesthetics and is all the wrong kinds of stressful, you're dating Resident Evil 6. Dump him, honey. Stressful fun is the same kind of apparent oxymoron as horror game. Do people really want to be frightened when they're playing a game? Isn't gaming supposed to be relaxing? You shouldn't want to spend your free time draining a slime-filled bathtub with a zombie in it to find a key to a swamp puzzle. Should you? Let's explore the sick little minds of Resident Evil fans, horror fans more generally, and talk about why people enjoy being stressed. We'll start with specific examples of where RE is at absolute peak form to illustrate my point. In the Raccoon City police station, all the lights are out. Of course they are, don't think about it too hard. Some zombie ran around with a hammer smashing all the light bulbs, so you have to look around the station with a flashlight which casts a narrow beam. Searching for everything with a torch is stressful because it makes the act of searching more technically difficult, and that added stress makes all scenes in the dark scarier. We love to philosophize about the human tendency to be afraid of the dark, but this is something else. Like, think about it. Would you rather have a torch or just not have one? It's actually scarier to have a torch in a game than just be in a dark environment. Only a little part of any room is visible to you at a time, which adds a whole extra level of complexity to the simple act of just looking at stuff. It's exactly the kind of change that makes gameplay a little more stressful in exactly the way that makes it more fun. You constantly worry that your beam will move across a spooky little guy and you'll have to switch to fight mode. But at the same time, searching with the flashlight is a discernible skill you can master, which feels really good. The earliest rooms that still have lights on are the rooms where there are typewriters, which you use to save. The fact the lights are on in all safe rooms makes an enormous difference to your experience of the space. These are your comfort zones, in between zombie-filled corridors of the rest of the station, which you know you can fall back on when the stress is too intense. But by the time you make it to the top floor, you probably will have developed a level of comfort with the torch and gotten used to lit rooms being safe. And then you enter the library, which is well lit and seems safe at first, and then you plummet through rotten floorboards onto the lower level and get swarmed by a load of zombies at once. See how the game gave you a basic stressful situation to master, and then right at the point where you were getting used to it, the game completely fucks with your sense of safety. In exactly the same way, the main hall of the station is a safe room for almost all of the game, and enemies can't come in safe rooms. But when Mr. X shows up and follows you around the building, he gives no fucks and walks right into the main hall anyway.
Leave me alone! Go away!
For another example, let's think about the kennels. In the lower level of the police station where you find the parking lot, the morgue, the shooting range, the generator room, the holding cells, and the kennels, I love this dumb little game. Why are all these things next to each other? It's like the art museum part of the station is just offices, and the parts that are actually a police station are just like shoved in the basement. Right, where was I? In the lower level of the police station, you encounter a bunch of zombie dogs. Obviously, the idea of a dog that doesn't die when you shoot it is one that would send a shiver down the spine of any American police officer, but here it isn't the monster design, but an innovation of level design that's scary. The scariest part of this whole level is the doggy doors. There are little gaps in the walls that let dogs run around and get between rooms you wouldn't expect them to be able to get to. And in all the hallways there are these weird barricades that stop you from being able to move straightforwardly, but the dogs can jump clean over them. The level design hampers your movement while at the same time giving them extra ways to move more easily. It feels more realistically scary in the sense that it resembles another sentient mind hunting you. It feels like a real animal is coming after you, especially in contrast to the zombies. The dogs are really not smart when you get a good look at them, running into walls and botching basic turning mechanics, but they don't need to be smart to be scary. They're dogs. What makes a dog scary in real life is its speed and ferocity, and the game replicates that perfectly by giving the dogs extra ways to maneuver the map that you can't use and effectively blocking off your points of ingress and egress. Basically the same concept is at play on a much larger scale in Resi 3 Nemesis. Nemesis is just set to follow you around the shortest possible path, but he can also jump really high and far if you manage to get too far away, and he occasionally just busts through walls, creating shortcuts that you wouldn't have. Video games are magical things, and different people express their love of video games in different ways. Some of us show how much we love Resident Evil by getting a tattoo of the Nemesis on our ass. Others express our love by making hours upon hours of video essay content about it. And others still express their love by learning to play games really, really, really fast. Let's talk about speedrunning. To want to dedicate so much of your time to the minute details of mastering an almost completely non-transferable skill, play and replay a game until all possible appeal and basic visceral fun has gone out of it, and past the point where it transforms from a piece of art into an unknowable other, mechanical and cold, the green raining code of the Matrix streaming down before your unblinking eyes, you have to want to suffer, at least on some level, right? Speedrunners are people who like to suffer, and gamers are people who deserve to suffer, so in that sense they fit in really well.
The human race requires judgment!
In a video about speedrunning, notorious beaver botherer H. Bomber Guy said that speedrunners enjoy a sort of logistical fun, like the pleasure you'd get from having your taxes done early. And I'd like to expand on the distinction between that and what I'm talking about here, because I think that while similar, they are distinct. To be clear, I think Harry's right on the money that speedrunners enjoy a sort of logistical fun of getting games done as fast as possible, but also I think that normal people don't enjoy games the way that speedrunners do, necessarily. Or sometimes they do, and that's what's so interesting about Resident Evil. When people get into Mario 64, certainly, they aren't very interested in completing the game as fast as possible, but speedrunners are. Fundamentally, these are different experiences. When you play Resident Evil, though, the beginner player and a speedrunner both want it to be over as soon as possible, albeit for different reasons. When Nemesis appears at the start of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, I cannot wait until the end of the game, when I'll pull out my great big gun and put it in his mouth. Wait, we did this joke already. Each section of the game puts pressure on the player to complete it and move on to the next, and each game design element makes that a struggle. And so the basic appeal of playing these games works a lot like how speedrunners actually approach a game. The developers seem to be in conversation with the speedrunners too, viewing them as their most dedicated fans. In Resi 2 Remake, when you blow up the wall to get a final medallion in the West storage room, that makes a lot of noise, and noise, of course, attracts lickers. Naturally, you'll try and get out of there as fast as possible, and that's why the developers put a unique hold-button obstacle blocking your path to the library. You have to hold and wait to move the bookshelf with a licker right behind you. It's agonizing. This is part of what I was getting at the start of the video. This is a part of everyone's experience, even though you could technically do things differently. There's a different exit to that room, even. That's just how sharp the world, mechanics, and enemy encounter design are. The people who like Resident Evil are people who enjoy stressful fun, and the people who like stressful fun are people who will like Resident Evil. But the people who like it the most, the ones who really need hardcore shit, make it even more stressful for themselves on purpose. After speedrunners began trying their hand at speedrunning the early games, highly competitive players started doing no damage runs, where, as the name suggests, you have to get to the end of the game without ever once being hit by any attack. From there, the speedrunners of the Resi franchise really entered sicko mode. This was the birth of the knife-only run, where players aren't even allowed a gun. In some ways, this run is interestingly easier because you have far fewer items to manage in the inventory, but in other ways, you have to defeat an entire city full of zombies with only a knife?
3 wee guys came out, wee bastards, and they started stabbing fuck out the horses.
What's particularly interesting about the speedrunning community in the Resident Evil games is that when the developers came to make Resident Evil 1 Remake, they put in a ton of extra modes. One of them is called Real Survival, and is based on early versions of the original, where the item boxes weren't connected, and you just had to know where the items were if you put them down, which is kind of a fun development note, but also the item boxes were connected in the final game because it was just kind of bad to have them disconnected. Other modes, though, seem to be made especially for speedrunner challenges. One mode is called ODZ, or One Dangerous Zombie, where occasionally, instead of the zombies that were supposed to be in a room, there'll be one very dangerous zombie. A zombie covered in grenades, who runs at you when you enter, meaning if you shoot him, you die instantly. The first thing here is obviously just, what the fuck? Who would want this? You'd have to be sick to play the game this way, and yet people do. The second thing is, the developers didn't just patch in this game mechanic, they wrote an entire backstory for the zombie. He's covered in grenades because he's a member of the team the protagonists came to the mansion looking for. They made him canon. They wrote the one dangerous zombie in as a canonical character. I just can't get over this running grenade zombie. What an awful thing to do to yourself. Damn, that's hardcore. I mean, I've heard of... Do you think that was all? Did you think that was the most extreme mode? You fool! You buffoon! The most extreme mode in Resident Evil 1 Remake is called Invisible Enemy Mode, and when you turn it on, every enemy in the game turns invisible. This isn't normal gaming. That isn't logistical fun. That isn't fun, is it? Does that sound fun to you? Because to me that sounds fucking incredible. I can't even pretend I don't get it. I've got the Resident Evil fever. That sounds amazing to me. My favorite thing about the ODZ mode is that once you switch it on, it's just on forever and you can't turn it off no matter how much you restart the game. So if you turned it on and then you try invisible enemy mode, sometimes you'll go in a room where you think you know how many invisible zombies there are, and instead there'll just be one invisible dangerous zombie who runs at you, and if you hit him he explodes, killing you instantly. And I say again, this sounds amazing. This is the appeal of playing Resident Evil. This is it. Some sort of bug crawls in your ear when you play these games and you start to enjoy absurd, punishing misery. It should be awful, it makes no sense, but it fucking rules. Different people express their passion about Resident Evil in different ways, and I'm not a speedrunner. I'll never be a speedrunner. I played all of Untitled Goose Game on the day it came out, and that was maybe the one time in my life I was in the top 100 fastest playthroughs of any game, just for a fleeting moment. The way I process my Resident Evil fever is by writing about it. And that's why I want to share something I think is really special here, both in appreciation of the games themselves and the people who play them at an unthinkable and frightening speed that I will never understand. If you complete Resident Evil Remake in Invisible Enemy mode in less than 5 hours, the game gives you a little unlockable. There's a bonus picture of Chris and Jill that says well done, and then it shows you this letter. Thank you for taking the time to play all the way through Biohazard, Resident Evil. If you're reading this letter, I salute you. You are a truly remarkable player. I imagine you must have had some pretty memorable experiences along the way. The pain of seeing the game over screen time after time, the sweet taste of victory after you finally beat the game, the feelings of camaraderie you shared with your character, the excitement and the overwhelming sense of dread. We believe games are more than just the product of a team of developers. It takes the support of dedicated players like you to make a game worthwhile. For this reason, we are truly delighted when someone enjoys one of our games as thoroughly as you have. Therefore, on behalf of the entire staff, please allow me to express our gratitude and congratulate you on a job well done. Thank you very much for playing. Shinji Mikami. Part 5. Everything you love, over again. Before we wrap up, I'd like to touch on something else about how Resident Evil 7 and 8 came together, and by extension, a big strength of the design of the whole series. I think it's pretty obvious to people that Resident Evil 7 reuses a lot of design elements from the original game. I mean, the Baker Ranch is pretty Spencer Mansion-esque, and actually you can find a document that confirms that diegetically the same architects that made the Spencer Mansion refurbished the Baker Ranch, which is a pretty good in-world explanation for why there are a lot of literally identical puzzles in both. Actually, it's the same architectural company. The original architect went missing in the 60s while the Baker Ranch was refurbished in the 90s. Sorry, this is deep lore, just bear with me 1 second. This makes me think of how they wrote a backstory for the one dangerous zombie. It's a justification for the in-game design. People in the same company were copying what the original genius architect made. For example, the shotgun can only be retrieved by finding a broken shotgun and replacing it, because the door to that area is a trap triggered by the weight of the gun. It's a reference to the trick ceiling that worked the same way in the original, which first spawned the iconic line,
"You were almost a Jill sandwich."
Resi Village is, if you think about it, a near-carbon copy of Resi 4. More action-focused, spooky village, mutated villages, there is even a tall aristocrat who chokes you, ooh woo, etc. One small thing I found really charming though, within Heisenberg's dialogue he calls Chris Redfield a boulder-punching asshole. Okay, that's cheesy, but it's also quite self-deprecating for the series to even bring up that.
Judgment!
I find it endearing and optimism-inspiring that the developers behind Village were confident enough in their game and in the renewed success of Resi as a franchise to poke some fun at one of the worst games in the series. The way Resi 7 and 8 recycle bits and pieces from previous games sound like it should be fan service, but it comes across as something else. The opposite. Fan salvation. After the previous two games were such nightmares, betraying everything that had ever made the franchise good. It manages to create a fresh experience that at once welcomes new players with open arms and introduces them to the core experience of what Resident Evil is really about. And at the same time says to the older players who were burned by the series' mistakes, we know what was good about our franchise. Come on in. Welcome home. Drain the bathtub. There's a key in there for you. The biggest strength of the series as we come to the Resident Evil Renaissance is their ability to recognize what was great about the originals, the spin-offs, the scrap projects, and hey, even what worked well about the worst games they've made, and bring it all back together into one cohesive, fun, terrifying experience. It's everything you love. Over again. The music in this video is made by Molly Noise for the channel, with additional tracks from the album Rainbow Road by Patricia Taxxon. I'd like to thank Quill, at Quilliteful on Twitter, who made my Claire Redfield costume, Sean, Tim, and DJ Mule, who lent their voices to the quotes in this video, my supporters on Patreon, who make this all possible, and you, the viewer, for watching all the way to the end. If you want to support my work, you can do so at patreon.com/Sophie from Mars, and for $2 or more than $2, you can watch the final part of this series and all my videos early when they're done. It'll be public on New Year's Eve, but I'm trying to get everything done before Christmas so I can finally relax. Please pray for me. Actually, give me money on Patreon, that's a lot more genuinely helpful. Anyway, I think this one came out even better than part 1, and I can't wait to get onto the ideology of Resident Evil next time. Thanks for watching again, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now!